So hello, everybody. Thank you for being with us today. I'm here to moderate the talk with our distinguished speaker. I promise to be brief, but I'd like to say a few words before we start. A few words about the International Machiavelli Society, of course. If you have connected to listen to this lecture, probably you already know some of the things I'm gonna tell, but repetita iuvant, as the saying goes. So let me repeat something. In the last 2 years, a group of scholars, Mario De Caro, Sean Irwin, Yanis Evrigenis, Vicky Sullivan, and me, promoted the foundation of an International Machiavelli Society. And today, I would like to thank Andrew Alquesta, who helped us with the organization of the online event. It is important to specify that, to thank them all, of course. This is the first reason to do that, but also because now when I say we, it will be clear that it's not a royal we. And the big question is, why did we feel the need to promote the foundation of this International Machiavelli Society? I can mention at least 2 reasons. First, the extraordinary renewal in Machiavelli studies. The research on Machiavelli is especially lively. Maybe one could say even too lively. In 2018, at least 15 monographs on Machiavelli were published in English and many more in Italian, German, French, Spanish, Portuguese. There is a clear rise in the interest for the topic. An organization like that one exists in Italy. So we thought that the growing number of scholars working on Machiavelli could benefit from a sort of network. Let's call the International Machiavelli Society a network. Somehow we wanted to fill that gap. The second aspect is the fragmentation of Machiavelli studies. This is not new, of course, but with so many publications every year, it became even more evident in the last decade. Machiavelli is studied by historians, literary scholars, philosophers, political scientists, and he studied in different countries with different intellectual traditions. This is clearly the condition of any true classic in an interconnected world, so no problem. However, this multiplicity tied to different disciplines and different national traditions and schools is at the same time a point of strength and a challenge for the scholars. The risk is that these different ways of reading these traditions could stop talking each other, which would be a loss for everybody. And here comes the International Machiavelli Society. We would like to help building a bridge to make it possible to discuss Machiavelli from different perspectives. Our goal is to bring together European and Anglo-American scholars and scholars coming from other continents too. Philosophers and historians, Italianisti, like me, and political scientists. So 2 weeks ago, the International Machiavelli Society hosted a philosopher for his lecture, Professor Harvey Mansfield. The same day, Professor Gennaro Sasso received the first Life Achievement Award of the Society. Today, it is the turn of an historian. So without further ado, it is a great honor for me to introduce Alison Brown. Alison is one of the most respected Renaissance scholars today. She's emerita in the Department of History at Royal Holloway at the University of London. Some of her essays are a real classic. The oldest were published many decades ago, and scholars still read them with profit and cite them. She has published 4 monographs and some collections of essays this far. Her last monograph is an excellent and much desired, let me say that, biography of Piero de' Medici, the so-called unfortunate, the de facto ruler of Florence before the expulsion of the Medici. and she has edited and translated Francesco Guicciardini and Bartolomeo Scala. And I have to say that, like many Renaissance scholars, I discovered the importance of Scala only thanks to her research. The core of her interest is clearly Renaissance Florence, but let me say, only few scholars proved to be so familiar with so many different fields in the last 50 years. Intellectual history, political history, history of the institutions, religious history, history of philosophy, a hint of art history. For all these reasons, the International Machiavelli Society is really honored to host her lecture. The title is Platonist or Epicurean, Reconsidering Machiavelli's Philosophy and His Golden Ass. After the talk, Alison will take 2 or 3 questions, but I promise to be brief, and so please welcome our guest, Alison Brown. Thank you, Alison. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriele. Well, I'm talking today about Machiavelli, as you've heard, as a Platonist or Epicurean, in response to Miguel Vacca's article of Asses and Nymphs, Machiavelli, Platonic Theology and Epicureanism in Florence, which he published online about 2 years ago, I think, and kindly sent me a copy of it. It was written as a direct challenge to what I wrote about Machiavelli and his hard primitivism in my book, The Return of Lucretius to Renaissance Florence, and a challenge too to Gennaro Sasso's and others' account of the poem as a Dantesque satire. This new Platonizing and mystical Machiavelli needs a response. And here, just let me say, I'm very grateful to Gabriele and Mario and all the Machiavelli Society for letting me air it here at one of the early meetings. Hard and soft primitivism are the terms used by Arthur Lovejoy and George Boas to distinguish 2 types of primitivism in their book, Primitivism and Related Ideas in Antiquity, which was published in 1935. Soft primitivism idealizes man's early existence in the idyllic golden or Saturnian age as a model of life lived simply and without constraint under the aegis of gods, which is what Vacca thinks Machiavelli adopted in his poem, The Golden Ass, or L'Asino, written around 1518. Whereas hard primitivism praises man's early life for its austerity and virtue, representing both a critique of civilized values, what they call cultural primitivism, adopted especially by cynics and stoics, as well as chronological or historical account of man's early history. The latter is how I would describe Machiavelli's account of early man in the Discourses, Book 1, Chapter 2. And the former, that is cultural primitivism, describes his critique of civilized values in The Golden Ass, especially in Book 8. However, I don't want my talk tonight to be simply a response to Vacca and a dispute over various types of primitivism. More important is the issue of Machiavelli's Platonic theology, especially since Plato and mysticism seem to be in vogue at the moment, with a book, I understand, on Machiavelli and Neoplatonism published just last year. The subject also raises the wider question of Renaissance syncretism as the attempt to integrate ancient philosophies with Christianity, especially with reference to the writings of Marsilio Ficino and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, who included the Jewish Kabbalah and the writings of Zoroaster and the Corpus Hermeticum in their sweep. Did Renaissance humanists assimilate everything that came their way? Plato, together with the Epicureans, soft Golden Age gods, together with hard primitivist cynicism? Or did they approach them more critically, according to their personal outlook and beliefs? What Felix Gilbert called the intellectual bond that unifies an individual's life and thinking, when describing Gasparo Contarini's apparently contradictory life as a Venetian statesman before he became a religious reformer. And it was a colpo di fortuna that I think Machiavelli would have appreciated, that when I opened my New York review of books a few weeks ago, what should I find but a review by John Gray on Wittgenstein, in which he wrote that Epicurus's view of the soul dying when we die and Plato's view of its immortality were incompatible. These were, he wrote, conflicting answers to questions that they had in common, only one of which could be true. This puts in a nutshell the problem that Vatter poses. Which is it to be, Plato or Epicurus, since only one of them can be true? And Machiavelli couldn't easily have combined them. Well, my strategy in response to this dilemma will be to look for Felix Gilbert's intellectual bond, or the explanatory thread running through Machiavelli's life that may help us to integrate his life and writings. Before I do that, I'll summarize Vatter's argument as I understand it, and some initial problems it raises, especially concerning Machiavelli's Platonism, before going on to describe what I see as this explanatory thread in Machiavelli's life, which I hope will help to answer the question, Platonist or Epicurean, as well as throwing light on his poem, The Golden Ass. I shall assume this Machiavellian audience is more or less familiar with the argument of the Golden Ass, which describes Machiavelli like Dante in the Commedia, lost in the dark wood, or actually it was a rocky island in the case of Machiavelli's poem, in the middle of the journey of his life, around, as I've said, 1518, when he'd lost his job in the Chancery and the patronage of the Medici. It's been fully analyzed by Gennaro Sasso as a Dantesque satire, as well as by Alberto Ascoli and Angela Capodivacca, showing how this autobiographical poem, incomplete though it is, like Machiavelli's life when he was writing it, it combines a summary of his philosophical view of the world, books 3 and 5, with biting satire of his contemporaries, a vendetta, as Sasso calls it, and a critique of humans' civilized lifestyle compared with that of animals in chapters 7 and 8, which for me, as I've said, exemplifies Lovejoy and Boas's historical and cultural primitivism as an account of hard primitivist philosophy, as well as an attack on civilized, or what we might call perhaps establishment values. For Vatter, by contrast, the poem has a very different meaning, reflecting soft Golden Age primitivism when men lived a carefree life under the aegis of gods. In 2 different episodes, the running boy, Machiavelli, casts off garments or coverings in order to expose himself, we're told, to the Platonizing mysteries about palingenesis and metamorphosis, that is, rebirth and transmutation, that were emanating from the Medici palace. The first episode is in chapter 1, where the boy is reinfected with his old malady of non-stop running by the sight of Via Larga opening before him. That's the Broadway of Florence, where the Medici palace stood, inciting him to throw off his cloak at the head of the street, and expose himself to the mysteries of Ficino's and Pico's Platonic theology. Crying, "Christ can't restrain me," he then runs off, which Vatter interprets as a sign of Christ's inability to restrain him from accessing the pre-Christian mysteries in the palace, Hermetic philosophers and so on, which included Botticelli's paintings of Primavera and Taming the Centaur. The second episode of exposure is in chapter 4. Here he throws off the bedspread, separating himself from Circe's nymph as they lie together, thereby opening himself to her divine Pythagorean and Platonic teachings. And since Circe was the daughter of the sun god Helios, this is another sign that her mysteries stemmed from the soft golden age, when gods still lived among men. Mysteries are, by definition, secret, like the dark web today. As Edgar Vint says, these late antique Hermetic sources go back to an ancient mystery religion, predating Homer and Hesiod, that are difficult to either prove or refute. And according to Karl Popper, they're typical of closed tribal societies that may have appealed to the conservative Plato more than to the skeptical and republican Machiavelli. This decoding of l'asino is nevertheless seductive in explaining a possible source for the political arcana for which Machiavelli is famous, especially the secret use of religion as a form of political control, which was exemplified, we understand, by Moses through the Kabbalah, and by Numa, the Roman king, the early Roman king, through Pythagoras and Plato's teachings. Plato, who famously justified his caste society by a single bold flight of imagination, usually called his noble lie or the allegory of the metals. All these men, and especially Moses, Numa, and Plato, are important for Vatter's interpretation of Machiavelli in Discourses, Book 1, chapters 11 and 12 on religion, and in Book 3, chapter 1, on the need to return to the beginnings. Despite its attractions, however, there are problems in accepting the influence of these unprovable mysteries on Machiavelli, as Vatter himself seems to admit. He tells us, for instance, that Machiavelli was horsing around in Via Larga after failing to be cured of his non-stop running malady by the quack Medici doctors, the Medici Ceretani, as they're called in the poem, which suggests to me that he was parodying, not praising, the mysteries administered by these charlatan Medici, by defying Christ and returning to his old active life, running around as the Chancery Secretary. There are also inconsistencies, or a riddle, as Vatter called it, in his book, Machiavelli's The Prince, published in 2013. An inconsistency between the Platonic or Messianic chapter 26 in The Prince and what he then called the Lucretian chapter 25, describing Machiavelli's theory of chance or fortune in terms of Lucretius's swerve or riscontro. But more important are the inconsistencies between the ideological role Vatter assigns to Moses and Plato as transmitters of these mysteries, and his attitude to them in the wider context of Machiavelli's Florence. Both Moses and Plato would have been familiar names to Machiavelli when he was growing up in Florence in the 1480s and 90s. Plato through the widespread vogue for his ideas during the Medici era, and Moses through the popularity of Fra Girolamo Savonarola, the Florentine Moses, as he was called. I've written very recently about Machiavelli's take on Moses in an article in the Storia di Pensiero Politico, so I won't repeat my argument here, save to say that Machiavelli's admiration for Moses was for the political leader evoked by Savonarola in his sermons, that is, for the fearless Moses, who was ready to kill when necessary, and an adroit and decisive political leader, a model of Savonarola's own leadership skills. We can't be sure that Machiavelli admired Moses as a magus or divine prophet, especially as Savonarola was much criticized for imitating Moses in this role. And if, as I imagine, he included Moses among all the legislators without exception, as he wrote in the Discourses book 1, chapter 11, who feigned their new laws came from God in order to get them accepted, it's much more likely that he derived this view from his chancery colleagues, as Francesco Bausi has said, rather than from the mysteries issuing from the Medici palace. Poggio Bracciolini had translated Diodoro Siccolo's Universal History, which specifically says that Moses invented his divine laws to secure the people's obedience. And we know that the history influenced not only Poggio, but also the Chancellor Bartolomeo Scala, who is a friend of Machiavelli's father, Bernardo, as we'll see. As for Plato, his influence on Quattrocento Florence was equally pervasive, especially after the publication there in 1484 of the great Editio Princeps of Ficino's translation of all Plato's dialogues. So Machiavelli may well, as Vatta suggests, have found Plato's laws relevant to his argument in Discourses 1, chapter 18, as well as in The Prince, that a single leader, young autocrat or prince, might need to take control in times of crisis. But that alone is not enough to make him a Platonist. There are many other sources for this idea, and more substantive ways in which, as we'll see, he disagreed with Plato, especially with Plato's theory of anamnesis, that our knowledge is acquired through recollection before we are born, or trailing clouds of glory, as Wordsworth has it. Also with Plato's ideas and idealism, and with the elitism of his innately qualified ruling caste of philosophers, who he pretends were created by God with gold in their veins. I described some time ago how the Medici used Plato to justify their power in Florence by idealizing themselves as Plato's philosopher rulers who combined power with wisdom and learning. So when Machiavelli wrote in his 1506 Ghiribizzi to Giovanni Battista Soderini that he didn't believe there were such wise men, that is, philosophers, who ruled above the stars, he surely had the Medici in mind. And similarly, when he wrote in The Prince that he didn't believe in imaginary republics like Plato's Republic. It's curious too, that if, as we're told, Plutarch's Life of Numa unlocks the meaning of L'Asino, that Machiavelli fails to follow Plutarch in quoting Plato's saying about states only being happy when ruled by philosophers. Plato's absence from Machiavelli's L'Asino is all the more striking if we compare it with the work that plagiarized it, Giovan Battista Gelli's dialogue Circe. In Gelli's Circe, only one animal fails to think animals are happier and freer than humans. That is the elephant, who was formerly a philosopher, in other words, Plato's man of ideas. He alone is willing to return to being a human on the grounds that human intellect and free will are superior to animals' sense and appetite, and enable man alone to conceptualize forms and understand the first causes of things. As Chiara Cassiani points out in her discussion of the dialogue, Gelli's argument is consistent with the Neoplatonism of Florence's 16th century academia and its program of cultural reform that gave a central role to education in creating a public ethic. So the comparison between Machiavelli's l'asino and Gelli's Platonizing Circe points out their difference. Machiavelli valuing the qualities of animals more than the higher life of the mind that can understand Platonic forms and the structure of the universe. Belief in Platonic forms also accounts for the difference between Plato's structural view of language, which owed its existence to the weaving together of forms, as Plato says in the Sophists, and Machiavelli's, who thought language developed naturally according to the changing times and different societies. And similarly, justice, which Plato thought was God-given, God being all and the measure of all things, whose justice was remembered and interpreted by the philosopher ruler, as he says in the Statesman and the Laws. Whereas Machiavelli rejected Plato's theory of anamnesis and thought men defined justice for themselves, as we'll see. I could go on, but now I want to turn to what I think made Machiavelli's thinking fundamentally incompatible with Platonic idealism, and that is his naturalism. But in my view, this is the intellectual bond that unifies Machiavelli's contradictory life and integrates his life with his writings. It's unnecessary to restate how much of Machiavelli's thinking was based on his view of nature and the natural world. Nature has created men with different faces, intellects and imaginations. Nature has created men who want everything and yet are unable to obtain everything. Men can't change their natures. You can't change your character, nor the disposition that the heavens give you, and so on. Faced with the immutability of the heavens that form our character, and the variability of nature's ever-changing cycles, the first two premises of Machiavelli's philosophy, if we can call it that, the problem, as Machiavelli sees it, is making our fixed characters adapt to nature's changes or mutability. His solution was first tentatively suggested in his 1506 Giribizi to Soderini, whose marginal additions allow us to see his thought evolving as he writes. One of these marginal additions is to challenge fortune, fortuna, she who governs us, as he calls it in Latino, and change according to the times. Another addition is do what your mind tells you to do, and do it with daring, audacia. Although Sasso sees these two additions as irreconcilable, non coincidono, I'm not sure. The first is perhaps general or everyday advice to change according to the times. But since he thinks this is psychologically impossible, the second addition explains that it takes daring or audacity to swerve or change step in order to escape from the inevitable cycle of growth and decline, which he thought was, only an exceptional person can do. And I'm sure you'll all be familiar with the famous image in Machiavelli's poem on fortune, that the successful man is the one who can leap from top to top of the wheel as it reaches the summit and before it descends. But he thinks, of course, that's impossible to do it because when we're being successful, we can't imagine things will change. Even so, the man of daring needs the opportunity to swerve, the break in the clouds, so to speak. That is occasio, which is the third premise in Machiavelli's view of the world, that provides the element of freedom, provided we are energetic and daring enough to grasp the opportunity when it comes. And we know this element of freedom was linked to Lucretius's swerve from Machiavelli's marginal comment in De Rerum Natura, book 2, lines 259 to 60. From motion, there is variety, and from it we have free will, or literally a free mind, liberam habere mentem. Whether this naturalism constitutes a coherent philosophy is a matter of debate. Gennaro Sasso and Nicola Baroloni are somewhat skeptical. Sasso talking of Machiavelli's naturalisms and underplaying their consistency as a philosophy, whereas more recently, Vittorio Morfino integrates them as the first three theses of what he does think is a coherent philosophy. These three theses are important because they explain, without any reference to teleology or divine providence, that some things happen necessarily by the laws of cause and effect. Some happen by chance, and others happen freely through our own agency. As I've suggested before, this tripart balance of forces, as defined by Epicurus, also usefully describes Machiavelli's account of a world without divine providence, but subject to these same forces of necessity, chance, and freedom. When Machiavelli does use the word providence, it's not God-given or teleological, but naturalistic, nature defining the limits within which we can act freely, as in L'Asino, where it's the stars and nature's cycles that limit his freedom. And here I think the Sasse very usefully reminds us that Machiavelli operated within Christian categories. So he does talk about providence, but it's not necessarily Christian providence. Justice too was described by Machiavelli in Discourses, book 1, chapter 2, as the expedient natural justice that defined goodness and evil in terms of the harm done to one's protector that might be done to oneself, which was only later replaced by laws made effective by the fear of punishment. And in The Prince, morality is also based on outcomes and self-preservation, where there is no judge to appeal to. It is a result that counts, and God doesn't want to do everything. This is the relational justice of Epicurus, who said there never was an absolute justice, but only an agreement made in reciprocal intercourse. And it differs from Plato's definition of God as the measure of all things in the laws and the standard of what is right, as well as from the natural law or might is right law, criticized by Plato in the Laws and the Gorgias. Similarly, religion for Machiavelli doesn't represent a truth system defined by God as part of his providential scheme for the world. Instead, he treats it, as John Najemi has said, historically and comparatively in terms of its cultural and political roles, comforting people in times of distress and disciplining them through fear of God and the afterlife, what Vatter calls Machiavelli's civil or political religion. It's true, as Sasso points out, that this distinguishes him from Lucretius, who condemned religion altogether. But Machiavelli nevertheless shared Lucretius's cultural or anthropological approach to religion and agreed with him that its power relied on fear and that placating the gods with altars and prayers would do nothing to save us. Whether or not Machiavelli believed in the immortality of the soul, and there's considerable evidence that suggests he didn't, his thinking is far removed from the Pythagorean and Platonic mysticism of Pico and his Florentine circle. However, Machiavelli's naturalism was much more than a philosophical system. It was also a habitus, expressing Machiavelli's own deeply felt emotions and his way of life, especially his passion for freedom, whether it was political freedom, freedom for himself to run without restraint, or freedom for the family's mad mule to go wherever it likes to regain its own way of life, as Machiavelli wrote to his son. He told his friend Francesco Vettori, when comparing his wide-ranging letters to nature's variability, that whoever imitates nature cannot be censured. And he repeatedly argued that it's impossible to go against one's nature. We can't go against what nature inclines us to do, as he put it in his Geribizi to Soderini, as well as in The Prince, chapter 25, and the Discourses, book 3, chapter 9, to the extent that he proposed the radical solution of institutionalizing instead of suppressing the natural passions that divided nobles and people, seeing them, as Pedullà has so clearly shown, as a source of dynamism, not discord, in the political system. This radical solution is also an example of Machiavelli's naturalism, serving as a critique of the civilized values of social peace and concord. Another example of this is the strikingly original and transgressive voice he gives to the plebeian wool carder in his Florentine histories, who declares that nature has made all men equal. Strip us bare and you'll see we're the same. Although the plebe is not thought to represent Machiavelli himself, the arguments Machiavelli gives him echo his own radicalism and his political advice to the young Medici prince, as the plebe told his co-workers the moment was fleeting and wouldn't return. Like Machiavelli, the plebe also challenges accepted norms by encouraging these workers to use force, if necessary, against the established order, and especially by telling them not to be deterred by conscience and religion, the fear of hell, from doing what was necessary. Most obviously, the wool carder offers a critique of the ruling elite, whose power and wealth, he says, were acquired through fraud and force. By giving him a voice in defiance of Plato's taboo against impersonating lower class people, Machiavelli was also signaling his own radicalism in defiance of convention. It's animalitarianism, a very ungainly word used by Lovejoy and Boas, is as transgressive as the wool carder's radicalism, but in the Latino, for in asserting the animal's superiority to humans, it not only overturns Plato's belief that humans were superior to animals, but Christian and humanist precepts too. For as Anselmi and Fazion point out, the boar was challenging the humanist canon by standing upright and asserting its free will by refusing to return to human status. Io rifiuto, he says, while Machiavelli in the poem was forced to turn his back to the heavens and follow Circe's nymph on all fours, a Tarpone, a total reversal of man's uniqueness in standing upright while animals lie prone on the ground. The boar also exemplifies animals' self-sufficiency and contentment compared with the unhappiness of civilized humans who restlessly travel the world to acquire luxuries and profit, are brave only to win fame and glory, and overindulge in lovemaking and eating. Underlying all these examples is a more fundamental illustration of Machiavelli's naturalism that has only recently been firmly established. That is, the illegitimate birth of his father, Bernardo. This has long been hinted at and denied, but only now has Luca Boschetto established Bernardo's illegitimacy beyond doubt. through his meticulous research into the Machiavelli family papers and tax records, demonstrating as well the impact this had on his and his son Niccolo's status and careers. But not only did it deprive them of their inheritance and palace in Florence, from Bernardo's uncles, they inherited only 2 farms in the countryside. It also excluded them from Florence's political life. Just 3 years before Niccolo would have been old enough to qualify for political office and membership of the Great Council, he suffered the bitter blow of finding himself disqualified from both by the law of 26 November 1495. So instead of enjoying political office as a citizen, he had to become a bureaucrat. Chose to become a bureaucrat, shall we say, working in the chancery as a civil servant. Even there, he was made to suffer from the taint of bastardy. For on his return from a mission to the emperor in 1509, in his role as secretary to the Ten of War, he was denounced for his mission and criticized by an opponent as the son of a bastard of the Machiavellis. As Boschetto says, this helps to explain Machiavelli's antagonistic or contrarian spirit and intellectual restlessness that characterized him for the rest of his life. It also helps to account for his naturalism. A bastard, by definition, is a natural child. And in Shakespeare's King Lear, the opening speech of the bastard Edmund invokes nature as his goddess and denounces the laws that deprived him of lands and status, with the bitterness that Bernardo Machiavelli must have shared. Why a bastard? Why brand they us with bastardy? Base, base. Legitimate, Edgar, I must have your land. Fine word, legitimate. The conflict between nature and laws is also reflected in the way illegitimate Florentine artists, Leon Battista Alberti and Leonardo da Vinci, use their natural creativity and constant praise of nature to defy the laws that worked against them. It's even more marked and closer still to Machiavelli's Florentine world in Bartolomeo Scala's fable called Laws, Leges, cited by Boschetto. The fable adopts the same nature-law antonym, whereby nature offers to help an illegitimate young noble who has been deprived of his inheritance and citizenship by the laws. Summoning the laws, nature turns them into spiders' web that stand firm only against the tiniest insect. Comes from the Lives of Solon, which had recently been translated, much quoted at the time. 2 years later, Scala repeated his fable in his 1483 dialogue De Legibus et Judicis on laws and legal judgments, in which Bernardo, Machiavelli's father, clearly identifiable as the young noble in the fable, debates the nature of law with Scala. Although it is Scala in the dialogue who has the role of arguing in favor of natural law, not Bernardo, Scala is nevertheless supporting his lawyer friend by arguing on his behalf, just as Bernardo's son Niccolo would do, whose definition of natural justice can perhaps be seen as a response to the bastardy that tainted him no less than his father. For me, it sums up why I regard naturalism rather than Plato's idealism as the bond that explains and integrates Machiavelli's life. So to conclude, I was going to do so by returning to Lazino to show how this critique come autobiography illustrates both historical and cultural primitivism in describing his hard philosophy of life and his critique of his contemporaries and their civilized values. But time presses, I think. So I'll simply end with a few concluding comments. Renaissance humanists certainly picked and mixed their ancient philosophies, and Machiavelli's retentive memory and irony drew on them all. It would be difficult to describe Machiavelli as adopting either Plato or Lucretius as a ready-to-wear suit. As pointed out by Sasso, as well as by Vatter, Machiavelli's view of the value of civic religion was not shared by Epicurus and Lucretius. And instead of escaping fear through understanding nature and living a life of Epicurean tranquility or ataraxia, Machiavelli valued fear as a sanction and enjoyed an active, engaged life, always on the run. Despite this, I hope I have confirmed what I have already written about Machiavelli's affinity with Lucretius and his philosophy by another route. That is, via the intellectual bond of Machiavelli's naturalism, which shows how much he shared with the Epicureans, not the Platonists, including his moral and social values, I should add, since it's been pointed out, or it's been stated that it was only his atomism he borrowed from Lucretius. It's his moral values as well, I would argue. His relational ethics, that is justice based on not doing to others what you don't want them to do to you, were identical with Epicurus's sign of expediency, and also with Christ's New Testament Sermon on the Mount, for those of you who want your Machiavelli to be religious. And of course, this is the analogy that was made by Scala in his dialogue. So this is closer to these views rather than with the commandments of Old Testament Moses or with Plato's God-given laws recalled by philosophers from a distant golden age. If I'm right in thinking that the consistency of Machiavelli's naturalism provides another route for understanding Lucretius's influence on Machiavelli, then it must surely be at the expense of the idealist and caste-conscious Plato, since they can't both be true. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Do you see me? Can you hear me?
Can I hear you?
Okay,
Yes.
great.
Yes.
Great. I was not sure. Thank you. Thank you very much, Alison. Thank you very much. I mean, it was wonderful. I mean, I had the opportunity to read you in advance, so I already knew some of your lines of thought, but thank you very much. I guess now we can proceed with the questions, if there are any. You said 2 or maybe even 3. So if somebody has a question, she could use the Q&A on the bottom, and I'll read the question to Alison.
Gabriele, if no one asks a question, I can, exploiting my role as co-organizer.
Oh, yes. Great, Mario. Thank you.
So, Alison, you briefly mentioned the issue of free will, and this seems to me one of the main arguments in favor of the thesis that Machiavelli was deeply influenced by Epicurus through Lucretius, of course. So it could be said that he was one of the first modern, perhaps the first modern libertarian, reviving a view that had been known in the antiquity. Carneade was one, but in a newly conceived and naturalistic environment. So the idea that free will needed contingencies, we would say indeterminism, and that made it possible in a Epicurean universe, of course, a non-deterministic universe. So what do you think of this?
Well, I agree with that, of course. You're the great expert on free will, Mario, so I think you made that point as well. I mean, what it seemed, I mean, in one sense, of course, it's perhaps inconsistent with the determinism of nature. But what I think is very interesting, that the very early, the first evidence really of his interest in it was his letter that hasn't survived, but the response has survived. Bartolomeo Vespucci, who was a Florentine teacher of astronomy in Padua, I think, and Machiavelli wrote to him asking if the wise man can change the influence of the stars or not. And so he was, this was in 1504. So he was obviously thinking about it, before he'd really written anything else. And what Vespucci replies is that, no, you can't change the stars because they're eternal, but you can man can change the influence of the stars, which for me is perhaps the earliest instance of Machiavelli thinking about it and getting, the idea, which he then follows up in the Ghiribizzi to Gian Battista Soderini by saying, yes, man can change. He can change step, but not changing the stars. So I don't know whether that is an answer to the question. I think, it always seems to me that Machiavelli thinks it's almost psychologically impossible for people to change if they're doing successful in the course they're adopting, that they can't really change it, but it takes this exceptional man who, can see what needs to be done and forces himself to do it, to change its course, which is not so easy. But I don't know whether you would agree with that.
Sure. Thank you very much. I agree entirely.
Thank you, Alison. We have two more questions. The first one was made by Alessandro Martina. Thank you very much for your lecture. Could you tell us more about the different approach to the essence of language of Lucretius and Plato and the way Machiavelli assimilated it?
Well, Machiavelli wrote a sort of disputed dialogue or a treatise about language, which may or may not be his. I don't know how the argument stands on that now. But he also very interestingly, I think in his Florentine histories, talks about how different countries, as they develop different languages, and how important it is to keep up with the changes, and even in his own day, and to follow what other people are doing. And of course, Lucretius's argument, which is very much part of the De Rerum Natura, is that language it comes from nature, and we start off with sounds like birds. Birds have a language, and animals have a language, and humans share the same language too. It's the same approach to a language, that they have to learn it. And this seems to me one of the big differences with Plato, who thought that language, well, from what I quoted from the Sophists, language is based on forms. Isn't that Chomsky's argument too? There are basic sort of pre-existing forms which language is based on. And I just see, although he didn't talk a great deal about it, but from what the way he did write about it, it seems to me that he sees it as something that develops naturally and in different countries, and it's not following an ideal form.
Perfect. I'll read you the second question by Catherine Robiadek. Thank you so much, Dr. Brown. Will you talk a bit more about Machiavelli's epistemology? If knowledge is not recollection, as for Plato, what is it? And what forms can we say it takes for Machiavelli? Relatedly, does it take on the contemporary debate about art as knowledge, which later thinkers like Cervantes certainly do in their literary works, in any important way?
Well, I'm not think I'm very quick to answer that, but I would say, I mean, one of Machiavelli's great sources of knowledge was history, of course. And I mean, I was debating really whether we could think of Machiavelli as a philosopher ruler. And he does, some points sort of say that, I think it's when I can't remember where he says it now, but when we reach the bottom of the cycle and we need reform, then it must be the good man who has knowledge of history, who pulls us out of the cycle and gets us going again. And I don't know, I thought this is the nearest he gets to the idea of theory of knowledge, that it's based on what has happened in the past, because history is cyclical and it will repeat itself. And therefore, if we know what has happened in the past, then we know what will happen in the future, or we should at least learn the lessons of history. But perhaps Gabriele can add to that, because he's the great expert on the discourses as history. Perhaps you disagree with me, but it seems to me that is sort of where he would get his knowledge from, experience of history.
I agree. I agree. And we have a third, and I will say maybe last question by Dhruv Jain. He writes, Robert Black has argued that the marginalia on Machiavelli's copy of De Rerum Naturae was students' fare. I was wondering whether you agreed with this assessment about the marginalia.
Or it's students' fare. I mean, what of the level of what a student would write, is it? Is that? If so, then
I guess he Black was suggesting that the marginalia are not so important because they are just the typical notes taken by a student working for the first time with a text. I mean, I will say that Bob was dismissing somehow the importance of the marginalia, and Dhruv Jain would like to know what do you think about this position, this judgment?
Well, I disagree with it, if that's the case. Shortly. No, I mean, I think they're fascinating, his marginalia, because especially what I was talking about before, Bartolomeo Vespucci, he's writing to ask him what he thinks about free will, whether we have this freedom or not. And these marginalia are in following the same line. He's wondering whether we do have the freedom. And in the end, it seems to me he thinks that we do have, despite his general feeling that we can't change our nature, and we can't do anything about nature's cycles. This is determined, and it's very difficult to do anything about it. And he also, I think, did believe in the influence of the stars. When he writes in the Golden Ass, that his fate, he's told by the nymph that his fate is fixed and he can't do anything about it at the moment until the wheel changes and comes up, and then things will get better for him again. So Machiavelli recognizes the deterministic, or what in the other thing I quoted as necessity, the element of necessity that you can't do anything about. And the two marginalia that I quoted get to the heart of this. He's going against what he's saying, you know, that people's characters, saying in the letter that people's characters can't change. We're all born with a certain character and we can't change it. Julius II can't change, and so on and so forth. And then he has these little thoughts which he puts in the margin, saying, but yes, with audacia, with boldness, we can change, we can do something about it. And this is then what becomes, for me at any rate, the essence of the freedom. It corresponds with Lucretius's idea that because of the soul, we do have the freedom. And it's a mental thing too. Lucretius has this, I think, sort of fascinating example of animals sharing this freedom. And he talks about horses in a race, and the bar is raised so the horses can start running. And he says that the horses don't immediately start running if it wasn't in the mind, if it was simply the physical restraint of the bar that was holding them back. They'd surge forward the minute the bar was lifted, but he said it isn't. They've got to think about it. They've got to think, yes, we're free, we can move now. And it's this sort of freedom that Machiavelli seems to me is talking about or working towards. And that's why I find these marginal notes fascinating, because they are part of that. That's part of that rethinking process. So that's my view of it. Maybe I'm wrong, but to me it's consistent with. But I think Bob doesn't really agree with the influence of Lucretius, so maybe that's part of it. I don't
know. Alison, thank you. It was just great. I mean, I learned a lot, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. So thank you very much. I guess we can announce this, that we decided to post the text of the lectures. So in the next few weeks, I don't know exactly when, maybe we'll post the oral version you wrote for today, and we'll do the same things with Mansfield lecture if he agrees. I guess he did. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Gabriele, perhaps you can add that in the fall.
Thank you, Gabriele, for chairing me.
Thank you, Alison. But you mean perhaps that in the fall we'll have other seminars.
Oh, so yes, of course, Mario, you're right. Yes, I forgot to say that. I mean, we started with Mansfield and Alison, but we want to go on with more seminars. Not too many, because we want to select them, and we know that there is maybe too much activity online this month, but we'll organize a couple of them in fall, and then we'll let you know about the famous conference which was scheduled for last December. I'm pretty sure that we'll be able to make it happen in 2022. So I'm happy that I'll be able to meet you all in Rome. Alison, thank you so much. It was just great. Thank you.
I'd say goodbye, having seen you for a brief period. It's reunited with everyone. But let's hope we can all meet again properly soon. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. I'm Mario.